The morning light in Los Angeles carried a deceptive peace that day, a soft glow that brushed against the glass windows of Liam's apartment and gave everything inside a golden calm it didn't deserve. The city, alive with its usual hum of ambition and vanity, moved forward unaware that inside that small apartment overlooking the skyline, something irreversible was about to happen. Hope had woken early, excited, her heart light and her thoughts consumed with small details, flowers, lace, the wedding dress she wanted Liam to see. Their love, she thought, had survived everything that life had thrown at it. The misunderstandings, the distance, the years of back and forth, they were finally here, standing on the brink of forever. But even as she tied her hair and smiled at her reflection, a strange unease fluttered in her chest, one she couldn't name but couldn't shake either. The night before, Liam had gone out for what was supposed to be a harmless bachelor celebration, a quiet evening with a few close friends before the whirlwind of wedding preparations consumed him. Hope had kissed him goodbye at the door, teasing him to behave, laughing when he promised he'd be home early. She didn't know that promise would dissolve somewhere between the last drink and the first mistake. The party wasn't wild by design. It was meant to be simple, a few drinks, some laughter. But Ivy was there, elegant, dangerous in her quiet way, a woman who carried her loneliness like perfume, intoxicating anyone close enough to breathe it in. She and Liam had once shared a complicated friendship, something that had always hovered just on the edge of temptation. That night, alcohol blurred those lines completely. As the music softened and most guests left, Ivy lingered. She and Liam talked, their words weaving old memories and fragile affection into something heavier. He was drunk, too drunk to recognize the weight of the moment. The night blurred between laughter and regret until boundaries vanished altogether. What happened after that was instinct, not reason. Two people lost in the fog of desire, driven by confusion, by weakness, by a loneliness neither wanted to admit. When the sun finally broke over the horizon, it illuminated the wreckage of a night that should never have existed, clothes strewn across the floor, glasses tipped over, and two bodies entangled beneath the sheets, unaware of the devastation waiting outside. Hope arrived just before noon, holding a garment bag and a coffee cup, humming softly as she pressed the elevator button. She'd been thinking of surprising him, of showing him the dress she'd chosen, wanting to see the look on his face when he realized how perfect it all was. As she reached his door, she noticed it wasn't locked. That small detail gave her pause. Liam was usually careful, especially now. When she stepped inside, the smell of alcohol and perfume hit her first. Her smile faltered. The apartment was a mess, bottles on the counter, clothes scattered like remnants of a storm. At first, she thought maybe he'd simply passed out after the party, but then she saw the trail of clothing leading toward the bedroom. A chill slid through her veins. The door was slightly open. Hope hesitated, her fingers trembling as she reached for the handle. She pushed it open just enough to see inside, and in that instant, the world she'd built in her mind shattered. Liam was there, lying in bed, his arm draped over Ivy's bare shoulder. Their bodies, naked and tangled, lay in the pale morning light like an accusation too cruel to speak aloud. For a heartbeat, Hope couldn't move. Her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. And then the reality crashed over her in full, violent force. Her throat tightened, her vision blurred, and before she could stop herself, a scream ripped from her chest. "Liam, what are you doing?" The sound jolted. Disoriented, hungover, Ivy stirred beside him, pulling the blanket over herself, her eyes wide with panic. Liam stammered something, words that made no sense, fragments of apology and disbelief, but it was too late. Hope was already backing away, her tears falling fast, her breathing uneven. The coffee cup she had brought slipped from her hand, shattering on the hardwood floor. For a moment, all three of them stood frozen in the wreckage of what was once love. Liam tried to reach her, his voice raw, begging her to listen, to understand. It was a mistake, he said, again and again, as if repetition could turn the truth into something else. But there was no language that could bridge the space between them now. Hope's voice broke as she answered, her words trembling with disbelief and pain. A mistake? You were supposed to marry me, Liam. The look in her eyes was not anger. It was devastation. The kind of pain that stripped everything human down to its core. Hope turned and ran before he could stop her, her sobs echoing down the hallway. Liam stumbled after her, calling her name, but his voice seemed to dissolve into the emptiness. Ivy sat in the bed, clutching the blanket, her face pale and wet with tears. She whispered Liam's name, but even she knew it meant nothing now. Whatever had happened between them in the blur of alcohol and loneliness had destroyed something sacred. Outside, Hope's world crumbled. The drive home was a blur of trembling hands and blurred tears. Every memory of Liam, the laughter, the promises, the vows they hadn't yet spoken, played in her mind like cruel ghosts. How could love turn so easily into betrayal? How could the man who swore she was his everything choose someone else, even for a night? By the time she reached home, her pain had hardened into disbelief. She wanted to scream, to throw something, to undo the moment she walked into that room. But there was no undoing it. There never would be. Liam, meanwhile, sat in silence long after Hope left, the sound of the broken cup still ringing in his ears. Guilt settled over him like ash, suffocating, relentless. He couldn't even remember half of what had happened. He tried to piece the night together. The laughter, the drinks, Ivy's touch, but the memories came in fragments, none of them offering redemption. Ivy tried to speak, to apologize, but he couldn't look at her. The reality of what he'd done was too unbearable. The woman he loved, the future he had built, all of it had vanished in a single night of weakness. As word spread, the fallout rippled through their world like shockwaves. Brooke tried to comfort her daughter, but even she struggled to hide her anger. She had never fully trusted Liam, had always feared that his indecision would one day break Hope's heart again. Steffi, hearing the news, felt a pang of sympathy she didn't expect. Liam's pattern of destruction had finally come full circle. Ivy, ostracized and guilt-ridden, tried to defend herself, claiming she had not meant for any of it to happen. But no one wanted to listen. To them, she was the symbol of betrayal, the reason Hope's heart had been broken once again. Days turned into weeks, and still, Liam couldn't sleep. He left messages Hope never returned, sent flowers that came back unopened. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw her face as she found him that morning, the disbelief, the heartbreak, the silence that followed. He told himself he loved her, that he had made the worst mistake of his life, but love no longer mattered. Trust, once broken, was not something even love could mend. Hope withdrew from everyone. She poured her energy into work, into anything that could fill the hollow space Liam had left behind. But even as she tried to move forward, the image of that morning clung to her. Every time she thought she had buried it, it returned, uninvited, cruelly vivid. She wondered whether she could ever forgive him, whether forgiveness would even matter if she did. Somewhere deep down, a small, bitter part of her whispered that she had always known this would happen, that Liam's heart had always belonged to too many people at once. For Liam, the realization came late but sharp. This was not simply about a drunken mistake. It was about weakness, about failing to protect the very thing he had claimed to cherish. The guilt became his shadow, following him through every meeting, every conversation. The world saw him as the same charming man, but inside, he was hollowed out. The sight of Ivy became unbearable, a living reminder of everything he had destroyed. Eventually, she left the city, unable to endure the constant scrutiny. Months later, when Liam finally saw Hope again, by accident, on a quiet street in Beverly Hills, she looked different. Stronger but colder. She greeted him politely, without anger, but without warmth. He tried to speak, to apologize again, but she stopped him with a quiet, steady voice. "You can't fix what you broke, Liam," she said. "You can only live with it." He nodded because she was right. Love, he realized, wasn't always a story of forgiveness. Sometimes it was a story of loss, a lesson carved into the soul. When she walked away that day, the wind lifted her hair, carrying it like sunlight through the air. He watched her go, knowing that whatever came next would be lived apart, their paths forever altered by a single, drunken night that no one could take back. The sea of Los Angeles glittered in the distance, vast and indifferent, as if to remind him that life moved on, even when hearts didn't. And in that indifferent beauty, Liam finally understood the true cost of betrayal, not the loss of love itself, but the loss of the version of himself that Hope had once believed in. It was that man, the one she thought he was, that died the moment she opened that bedroom door. The decision came quietly, without the shouting or tears that had once marked every turning point in Hope's life. After weeks of sleepless nights and the constant ache that came from seeing Liam's name on her phone, she finally accepted what her heart had been trying to tell her all along. It was over. There was no salvaging what had been broken in that room. The betrayal wasn't just about a night or a body. It was about trust, about the unspoken promise that love would always be enough to anchor them. When that promise collapsed, everything else followed. She had spent too long forgiving Liam for being human, for being flawed, for being pulled between the women he claimed to love. But now, for the first time, Hope realized she wasn't angry anymore. She was simply done. On a gray morning heavy with silence, she packed her suitcase. The apartment, once filled with laughter and plans for a future, now looked like a museum of false beginnings. The framed photo on the nightstand, the one of her and Liam smiling on the cliffs of Malibu, stared back at her like a cruel reminder. She placed it face down. Then she turned to Douglas, who sat on the couch, watching her with wide, uncertain eyes. He had sensed it too, the tension that filled the air, the sorrow that hung between words unspoken. "We're going on a trip," she said gently, forcing a smile. "Just you and me. Somewhere far away from all this." Douglas nodded slowly, trusting her, as he always had. In that moment, Hope felt something she hadn't felt in months. Freedom. Fragile but real. Europe had always been her dream. Paris, Rome, Florence. Cities where beauty lived in the cracks of history, where love stories were written and rewritten 1,000 times. Maybe she wasn't looking for love anymore, but she was looking for herself. She needed distance, not just from Liam, but from everything that had become of her life in Los Angeles. The rumors, the pitying looks, the endless comparisons to her mother's heartbreaks, they had all carved away at her until she barely recognized the woman in the mirror. Now she wanted to see the world through new eyes, not as someone's fiancé, not as someone's consolation prize, but as Hope, whole, wounded, and still capable of healing. When she left, she didn't tell Liam. He learned about it from Brooke, who handed him a simple envelope the next day. Inside was a letter written in Hope's delicate handwriting, firm, steady, but laced with quiet pain. She didn't accuse him or recount the betrayal. Instead, she wrote about forgiveness, not for him, but for herself. "I need to go," she wrote. "Not to escape you, but to find the part of me that kept waiting for you to change. I can't live my life hoping someone will become the person I believed they were. I have to believe in myself instead." The words were gentle, but final. Liam sat in silence after reading them, the sound of the waves outside mocking the stillness in his chest. By the time Hope and Douglas boarded the plane, Los Angeles was already fading behind them. She looked out the window, watching the city shrink into a blur of lights and memory. Douglas leaned against her shoulder, already asleep, his small hand curled in hers. She promised herself that she would protect him from the storms that had consumed her, that this trip would be about renewal, not running. But deep down, she couldn't help wondering whether the ghosts she left behind would ever truly let her go. Back home, the news of her departure rippled through the Forrester and Logan families. Brooke wept quietly, torn between pride and worry. She admired her daughter's strength, but feared the loneliness that came with it. Liam tried to reach out through messages that went unanswered, his apologies swallowed by distance and time zones. And then there was Thomas. For weeks, He had kept his distance, respecting the boundaries Hope had drawn after everything that happened between them. But when he heard she had left the country, something inside him shifted. For so long, he had lived in the shadow of his own mistakes, the obsession, the lies, the desperate attempts to mold love into something that fit his needs. But he wasn't that man anymore. Therapy, fatherhood, and heartbreak had changed him in ways even he hadn't expected. He no longer saw Hope as a prize to win. He saw her as a person he admired, someone he could care for without condition. And yet, part of him still believed they were connected by something deeper, something that had survived every mistake, every separation. As Hope wandered through the cobblestone streets of Paris, she thought of Thomas more often than she cared to admit. The memories of him weren't sharp or painful like those of Liam. They were softer, quieter, fragments of moments when she had felt understood. The way he looked at her when she doubted herself, the way he believed in her designs, in her motherhood, in her strength. She remembered the times he'd simply been there, when everyone else expected something from her. But even as those thoughts stirred warmth, they also carried caution. She had once been lost in the illusion of being someone's salvation, and she wouldn't repeat that. If Thomas was meant to be part of her life again, it couldn't be out of loneliness. It would have to be out of choice. In Florence, she found herself sketching again. Mornings by the window, with Douglas playing nearby, she would draw gowns inspired by the women she saw walking through the city, graceful, unapologetic, alive. Fashion had always been her language, and through it, she began to rediscover her voice. Letters came from home, from Brooke, from Steffi, even from Ridge, updating her on Forrester's latest collection. But the one that caught her off guard arrived in handwriting she recognized instantly. Thomas. His letter wasn't about love, at least not in the way she expected. It was simple, honest, filled with reflections on life and growth. He told her about Douglas, about the things he missed, about how proud he was of both of them. He didn't ask her to return, nor did he beg for forgiveness. He only said he hoped she was happy and that he believed she deserved peace. It was that humility, that quiet sincerity, that stayed with her long after she folded the letter away. For the first time in months, Hope smiled without guilt. As weeks turned into months, something inside her began to settle. The pain didn't vanish, but it transformed from raw grief into understanding. She realized that endings weren't always tragedies. Sometimes they were simply openings disguised as heartbreak. Europe gave her perspective, a life not defined by who she loved, but by who she was becoming. And somewhere between the ruins of Rome and the lights of Paris, she began to forgive Liam, not because he deserved it, but because she didn't want to carry him anymore. When she finally returned to Los Angeles, the city felt different. Or maybe she was. She moved with a quiet confidence now, unshaken by gossip or pity. She went back to Forrester Creations, her designs bolder, freer, infused with the kind of truth that only pain could teach. Thomas was there when she walked into the studio for the first time, surprised but careful not to show too much. Their eyes met, and for a moment, the air between them filled with all the words neither had said. He smiled first, and she returned it, small but genuine. Over the following weeks, they found a rhythm again, one not defined by romance but by understanding. They co-parented Douglas, they worked side by side, and slowly, the walls around Hope's heart began to soften. Thomas didn't push, he simply stayed, steady, patient, different. There were moments, fleeting but undeniable, when she caught herself wondering what it would mean to start over, not as the woman broken by betrayal, but as someone ready to love again. One evening, after everyone had left the office, Hope stood by the window, watching the city lights shimmer across the horizon. Thomas walked in quietly, setting a sketchbook on her desk, one she had left behind years ago. "You forgot this," he said, his voice gentle. She opened it and found the drawing she had once made, a gown she had never finished, one inspired by a dream of love that had seemed impossible. "You still could," he said, nodding toward it. Their eyes met again, and in that shared silence, something passed between them. Not the fire of infatuation, but the calm recognition of two souls who had been through their own storms and somehow survived. Hope didn't answer right away. She didn't need to. The future wasn't something she wanted to rush into anymore. But for the first time in a long time, the idea of it didn't frighten her. Maybe she and Thomas would find their way to each other, not as a rebound, not as redemption, but as two people who finally learned how to love without breaking. Or maybe their story would remain what it was, a gentle understanding, a second chance at peace. Either way, as the city lights reflected in her eyes, Hope felt the weight of the past finally lift. She was no longer the woman who walked into that bedroom and saw her world collapse. She was something new, resilient, self-assured, and ready to live without fear. And somewhere deep down, she knew that whatever came next with Thomas, with herself, it would no longer be built on broken promises, but on...
Oh,